Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Last year, since I got 8 guys in our group, right? I was the only Shema guy in the group. By the time we finished, 6 other 8 Shema shots.
Okay. Wow, mamish. What do you think caused it?
And that's years, 4 or 5 years.
Sure.
So, and of the 8, I'm the only one left in South Africa.
Okay, welcome to one and all. Page 19A3. Okay, so we're busy discussing the different offerings and korbanos that are relevant to the land of Israel, such as the Meiser, the tithe, the Bikurim, the Bechor, the firstborn. This is what we've been discussing of recent. That's how the whole chapter began. Let's go straight in. Umayka Sovar. We was asking questions as to whether the contribution of Meiser or the contribution of the Bechor, the firstborn korban, the sacrifice, are they equal in law? Or are they not equal in law? And can you learn one out from the other? Can't you learn one out from the other? And therefore, you may have to. That's why they have a specific pasuk or verse to help you understand that particular law. So, as you can see, the Gemara continues then its analysis of this brisa, noting that Rabbi Yishmael seeks a source only for the law that Meiser Sheni cannot be eaten nowadays, but he assumes this very same condition in the case of the Bechor offering, even without a special source, because we derive one from the other. Okay. Umayka Sovar. How does he see this distinction between the Bechor offering and the Meiser offering? Where's the similarity between the two? If you look at, let's go through some principles here before we get going. Look at 22. To properly understand the Gemara's ensuing discussion, several concepts must be explained. There was a question whether Kedusha Rishona, Kitcha L'Shaita, the Kitcha L'Asid Lavoi. The initial sanctity, which means when they came into the land of Israel first, led by Moshe Rabbeinu, or led by Yeshua actually, and they sanctified the land for the very first time. It took its effect for its time and for all future time. Is that, in other words, is that what Israel became? Israel became holy and ready for these type of sacrifices the moment Yeshua came in. This question is actually divided into 2 distinct categories regarding A, the sanctity of the land of Israel, and B, the sanctity of the temple site. In regards to the sanctity of the land of Israel, want to come closer? Oh, 19A3.
19A3.
Yeah, and yeah. Oh, it's different pages. Interesting here. Huh? Look at that.
Is it not a different volume?
No, it's a different layout. It's different. We're on this one.
So
Is there a footnote number? See, all the footnotes are different here. Look at this. This one, 12. This is the earlier version. So up to here. In regards to the sanctity.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. In regard to the sanctity of the land of Israel, this question relates to whether the law is dependent on the land of Israel, i.e. Trumas, which is a contribution to the Kohen, and Maasros, which is the tithe, which came into effect when the Jews originally took possession of Israel, here's the question, do they remain biblically applicable in Eretz Israel even after the nation has been exiled from the land? That's the question number 1.
Did it apply without the temple?
Did it apply? Yes. Mishka, yeah. As soon as the people conquered the land, and they all had their. I think that we had to wait until they all had their allocated sections of the land, which means they were residents. Then it started to apply because there was still the Mishkan. So they came to the Mishkan with their contributions, not necessarily. I see your question. Is it dafka related to the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim? That's your question, or does it relate No, I think it relates to the Mishkan. The whole pasuk, that whole verse, I don't think it had to be Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim. Well, look, wait 1 second. So the first thing is Israel. We're going to get to the next thing. I think that's why he's dividing it up. The first thing is Israel. So does it remain biblically applicable in Eretz Israel even after the nation has been exiled from the land? In other words, once you make it holy, it remains holy. That's the first opinion. If the original sanctity remains for all times, then these laws are always biblically enforced. Right? Then the laws of sacrifices are biblically enforced. If the sanctity ceases with the exile, these laws cease to biblically be applicable as well. So the question is now, we need to know, before you discuss the laws of Bechor and Meiser, the firstborn and the tithe, we need to know, is the land holy? Is the land considered holy even at a time of exile? That's the question.
And which land is it? Israel.
Israel.
So why would you not
It,
don't take it for granted?
there was.
That is holy.
Okay, so what does it mean to be holy, right? Is it the chosen land? Yes.
What makes it holy? Is it maybe the Beis Hamikdash?
No. So before we get to the Beis Hamikdash, the residence of Bnei Yisrael in Israel makes it holy. The moment Israel doesn't rest in the land, and you can argue about today because you can say that we have more than half, they say, of Jews live in Israel today, but it's still not all. So the question is does the kedusha does Israel retain its original kedusha or not? It's interesting because we do say that the Shekhinah rests in Yerushalayim and the Kotel HaMaravi and the holy cities and the holy places. True, but maybe we're talking about a certain level of kedusha which we may not reach at a time of exile, and maybe the land is lacking a certain level of sanctity as a result of exile. The Jewish people left it. No, then it goes back. Because then Israel goes back, then the Jewish people go back. When the Jewish people go back, then it retains its sanctity again.
What exactly defined as exile? Yeah, if there's one Jew left there.
Yeah. You mean if there's one Jew left in exile, is that considered exile?
In Israel. One Jew left.
I can ask the other way around. No, I'm not saying you can flip the question also. What happens if 3/4 of world Jewry, or even more, are living in Israel, and there's a minority living in Chutz La'aretz? Is that considered exile too? Yeah, but both sides. How do you define the way Bikurim works? The initial instruction about Bikurim is that the whole nation had to be in the land. And in fact, I said that even when you received your property, and you received your land, and you began to work your land, Bikurim would not start until you got your land and you got your land. Now, I could not rush into it just because I inherited land earlier than you. I had to wait for you, because that shows about the unity of the Am. The whole nation needs to be there.
And it extended the other side of the Jordan.
Right. Then we had the 2.5 tribes that wanted extra lands. They got the extra lands. Which, by the way, that means that Jordan is going to be part of Israel. Right? When Mashiach comes, we're going to have a land once again with the Jordan River dividing us, like it was then. Yeah. Okay. So that's the first point, is Israel. The second point is B, the right-hand column, in regards to the sanctity of the temple site, now the Beis Hamikdash. The question relates to whether the temple site in Jerusalem retains its sanctity even after the temple is destroyed. That's Har HaBayit. That is, do the various laws of offerings that apply only at the temple site remain in force even during the period of the temple's destruction? Practical application of this question emerged from the Gemara's discussion below. The two questions are not interdependent. Thus, for example, one could hold that the requirement to separate Trumas and Maasros might still be biblically enforced today because the sanctity of the land remains, and therefore Truma to the Kohen and Maaser to the tithe may remain in place. But the Maaser Sheni, which is separated to be eaten in Jerusalem, cannot be eaten in Jerusalem because you may say that the sanctity of the temple site has been suspended. If the sanctity of the temple site has been suspended, and you can't eat Ma'aser Sheni in Yerushalayim. He's saying that the two questions don't have to be interdependent. You could hold that Israel retains sanctity, but Har HaBayit doesn't retain sanctity. I guess you could hold vice versa also. You could hold that the Har HaBayit retains sanctity, but not necessarily Yerushalayim. Rabbi Shmuel in this brisa clearly holds that the sanctity of the land of Israel is still enforced nowadays. For since he discusses whether it might be permitted to bring Ma'aser Sheni to Yerushalayim and eat it there, so he's already discussing about Ma'aser Sheni, he must view the requirement to separate Ma'aser Sheni as still applicable. In other words, if he's debating about Ma'aser Sheni and can you bring it to Yerushalayim and can you eat it, the fact that he's considering whether you can eat it or not means that he holds it in place. If he holds it's in place, he means that the country deserves it. The country's sanctity deserves it. His uncertainty as to the permissibility of eating it hinges on what the status of Yerushalayim is nowadays. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yishmael takes for granted that a Bechor, okay. So in other words, like this, he believes that Israel retains its sanctity, and therefore Ma'aser Sheni, the tithe of Ma'aser Sheni, does apply. His debate is, can you eat it in Yerushalayim today, or must you put it into the ground and let it rot? Meaning, the land retains sanctity. That's why you have to separate the fruit. Jerusalem doesn't retain sanctity, and therefore you can't eat it there. So you got to let it's like limbo. You got to separate it, but you can't eat it. So what must you do? Put it aside. Now he says, then, nevertheless, Rabbi Yishmael takes for granted that a bechor may not be eaten nowadays, even in Yerushalayim. A bechor may not be eaten. Okay, so the Bechor for sure can't. Ma'aser Sheni is debating. The Bechor, the firstborn animal, cannot be eaten in Yerushalayim. The Gemara therefore investigates what Rabbi Yishmael holds with respect to the sanctity of the temple site. Why does he say that the Bechor may not be eaten today in Yerushalayim? Is it because he believes that the temple site is not holy anymore? Now you understand what ramifications this has in modern day Israel. The whole debate of whether or not you can go up to Har HaBayit or not today is dependent on this debate. Does Har HaBayit retain its original sanctity now that Israel is not living there, or now that the nation are not fully there? It's all related. It affects the fruits of whether you can eat the fruits of Yerushalayim or not. It also affects the question is whether you can ascend the mountain or not.
Because at the time of the base of Mikdash, only that Kohen would go.
To what? To go up.
Yeah.
No, others too. You have to be pure. You have to go to the mikveh. Yeah, and today, even if we go to the mikveh, which many people do, they're not purifying themselves from the dead body and other impurities. So the general consensus is actually I don't know what the new. There's a new trend about the religious Zionists, such as Ben Gvir and others. Ben Gvir, the politician, are going. I don't know how they justify it. The Kotel has always had a sign on the entrance that the chief rabbinate of Israel does not allow the community to ascend in Har HaBayit, because the tradition was that in today's times we're not pure enough, and the sanctity is there, and therefore we can't ascend. Lately, in the last 10 odd years, there's a new movement which is not necessarily subscribing to the chief rabbinate of Israel, which is okay. I guess they have other authorities that are guiding them. It's politics. It's also religious Zionists versus Haredim. That's also the internal debate. People blame the chief rabbinate as being Haredim, and they're coming from the modern Orthodox religious Zionist rabbanim, and so that's also debate. And nobody knows what to do. So you have certain groups of people of the religious sects that are going up. I don't know how they explain the sanctity of Har HaBayit. I don't know if they believe that it is holy, but yet we can still go up. I don't know if they believe it's not holy, that we can still go up. They can definitely not purify themselves. Also, they'll say that they're not going all the way. They're only going on the top of the courtyard. I don't know where exactly the border of the Beit HaMikdash was and how that works either. Do you know there has been a debate about Kohanim, not even Kohanim, everybody. When you put notes into the Kotel, there's a debate about the sanctity within the walls of the Kotel. In other words, when you look at the width of the Kotel, it means within the cracks. The debate was, does it belong to the outside or does it belong to Har HaBayit, inside? The moment you pass that first brick or the first crack and you put your hand inside, right? There's a debate among the authorities as to what is the status of the width of that brick. And therefore, if it's considered Har HaBayit, I guess it's like a debate with your neighbor, right? There's a discussion. The Gemara has this discussion about chometz. If chometz is found in a wall in between the two neighbors, in a crack in the wall, who does it belong to? Who must now go burn it, nullify it, or whatever the case may be? Where does it belong?
Master's property.
Chris doesn't get it.
Yeah, okay, right. So the debate that I've seen is regarding the kotel is how do you define that, and whether you're allowed to put your hands inside, because your hands may be impure in today's status. You can't properly purify yourself, and now you put your hands into the wall, you're trespassing, so to speak. You're now entering kedusha. Yeah, that's very fine picking. It's fine picking, but it's interesting. No, because then you're the external. Because once you protrude inside, where's the bad? So although you can say, you can say it's ridiculous. Okay, you could say it's ridiculous, but it's a fascinating debate as to if you don't want to go to Har HaBayit, what do you consider the inside of the wall? If it's Har HaBayit, then you can't put your hands inside the cracks.
But it was quite thick.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
It's all part of it.
yeah. So now the question is, at what point does Har HaBayit begin? And what happens in between? Is it no man's land? Anyway, so the point of this debate is actually very interesting. It's not just regarding Meiser and Time.
So was it the same wall?
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. This is Herod's addition. The bottom is from if you go down the excavations. The bottom is, and then they added on. But here's the point. It's not so much about the brick. It's the space that the brick fills. So the brick fills a certain width. That width, is a part of Har HaBayit or not? That's the debate. So if you're following the majority of opinions that don't want you to go up on the mountain today because of lack of purity, etc., well, then the question is the holes and gaps in the kotel. Is that a problem?
So suppose an airplane can't fly over either.
Oh, no. So there we have the question of because what's the concern? The concern is what? Impure.
The hope is that
So that's the famous debate of Kohanim. Have you heard about this? The Kohanim have an issue flying over graveyards. Some Kohanim had an issue because the airplane roof is an ohel for them. In other words, the rule is that Tuma, I can't remember the whole logic. Tuma goes up, and the ohel is a problem, right, for any Kohen.
There was certain route from Israel that allowed, I think, to the east that certain people wouldn't fly by.
You can see pictures of all funny. There's all sorts of memes now where you see people in plastic bags. Have you seen this? A Kohen is sitting in a rubbish bag in an El Al plane, and you say like this is a Kohen trying to protect himself from impurity. It doesn't work. A bag. I don't know what. I don't know if he doesn't want to see immodest people around him, or he's worried about his kahuna status. I'm not sure, but that doesn't really help. I have cousins, my grandfather's, I think, first cousins. One was a Dayan in London, Dayan Berkowitz. He passed away about 5 years ago. And his brother was an aerodynamics scientist in Haifa, 2 brothers. And they wrote a tshuva, responsa, on this topic. The Dayan in London wanted to research this issue of whether a plane can be considered an ohel over a graveyard. So he spoke to his brother, the aerodynamic scientist, and based on his research of how a plane works. Again, I don't really know the full debate. He wrote a responsa with that information. Right, cute? 2 brothers.
That you could fly to Saudi Arabia.
Now you can.
The airlines changed their routing on the flight. So those Kohanim who wouldn't fly.
Oh, really? Now can.
to the east.
Yeah, I don't know if it's an issue, but obviously some people made an issue out of it. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's go back into the Gemara now. The question we're asking in the beginning of the right hand, middle of the right hand column, Micah Sovar. What does he hold? Ika Sovar Kedusha Rishona, the original Kedusha, the original sanctity of the temple. You can see the article adds in the temple here because he's not discussing Israel as a whole right now. He's discussing the temple specifically, the temple site. If you hold that it was sanctified for its time and for future time, then afilu b'chor nami. Then you should be able to allow the b'chor to be eaten. That's the firstborn, which is eaten by the kohen, by the way. And Ma'aser Sheni. In other words, it should carry the two laws. Why does there be a small hold that the Bechor can't be eaten in today's times? If you believe that the sanctity is the same sanctity, then it should both apply. Ma'aser Sheni and the Bechor. Okay, let's go on. If you believe that the original sanctity of the temple was sanctified for its time, but not for future generations, in other words, once the community is exiled, therefore the Yerushalayim or the Beis Hamikdash doesn't retain its same sanctity. Then even the Bechor, let's debate it. You should be asking, why? In other words, why are you asking about Ma'aser Sheni specifically? Why is Ma'aser Sheni the debate? The Bechor should also be under question. It's the same concept. You take the firstborn cow, animal, to the Beis Hamikdash, you hand it over to the Kohen. It's the same question. Because now it has to be eaten in Yerushalayim, specifically.
But does the Bechor take the service?
It needs, yes, because it's brought to the Beis Hamikdash.
Doesn't need it. According to the notes of Rashi.
Ma'aser doesn't need the actual service itself.
The Ma'aser Sheni doesn't require.
Which footnote do you point?
25. Doesn't require any temple service.
That's the state of Yerushalayim as being the presence of Hashem, as Ma'aser Sheni continues even though the state has been suspended. This Kedusha still relates. I understand that. Yeah. I don't think Bechor needs either. You bring the Bechor to Yerushalayim, you hand over the Bechor to the Kohen, that's it. No, you don't need any offering on the Mizbeach. Right? Yeah. Ma'aser Sheni, the owner eats. The Bechor, I'm pretty certain you hand over to the Kohen. Once he receives the Bechor, that's it. It's his, and he can do as he wishes. So the question is, make up your mind. If Yerushalayim retains its sanctity, then Ma'aser Sheni and Bechor, both, should be permissible to be eaten in Yerushalayim. If the Bechor doesn't retain its sanctity, right, then you should be, if the Yerushalayim doesn't retain its sanctity, then you should be questioning the Bechor, just like you question the Ma'aser Sheni. In other words, is there a difference between the Ma'aser Sheni and the Bechor? Ravina comes along. Ravina, page 19A4. Ravina comes along and he says, "Lo'olam kasava." Really, Rabbi Shmuel, who's the opinion that we're debating, really holds kitcha l'shaita b'likitcha l'azilava. He really holds that the sanctity is an original sanctity, but not necessarily now. It was initially sanctified, but for its time and not for all future time. Okay. Now, here comes the question. Here comes the answer. We're painting the following picture. This is what he's talking about. We're talking about a Bechor whose blood was thrown. This goes back to Craig's point. Whose blood was thrown on the altar as part of the sanctity. I don't think the Bechor is offered on the Mizbeach. The blood sprinkled on the altar before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. It's a very unique case. It's isolated, sure, but that's called hypothetical debate. Is you create a scenario and you say, what do you say in this scenario? The scenario was that the Bechor was arrived before Churban Bayis, before the destruction. They sprinkled the blood before Churban Bayis, before the destruction. Now, what happened after that? Came along the Romans and destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. Bechor over Bayis, and then they destroyed it. V'adayin b'soroi kayom, and the meat is still there. And the Kohanim have not eaten that meat yet. In a unique case, in fact. But I guess it could have happened. It could have happened. We have a right to debate it. So, right? Umakshinon. Okay, let's continue. Umakshinon besoroi ledomoi. And we compare the meat to the blood.
How would you compare it?
Because look at the verse 28. The Torah places the two in juxtaposition. But the firstborn, their blood shall you apply to the altar, and their meat shall be to you, to the Kohanim, to eat. This indicates a hekesh, which means juxtaposition, between the meat and the blood. Because remember, you're midway through the service. The blood you've sprinkled, but now you want to eat the meat. The question is, now can you do so if there's no Beis Hamikdash anymore? So let's see how he compares. It's the last line on the column. Ma domei b'mizbeach, just like the service of its blood is conditional on the existence of the altar, meaning you need a mizbeach in order to sprinkle blood, which he did because there was a mizbeach, but now there's no longer a mizbeach; it's taken away. So if blood is dependent on the altar, next to the column, af besorei b'mizbeach, so too meat is also dependent on the mizbeach. And now you no longer have a mizbeach. What are you going to do? You no longer have a mizbeach. You can't let the kohanim eat. There's something around the sanctity of the mizbeach. And both, it will qualify the blood and the meat. And although the blood was sprinkled, now you can no longer eat the meat because there's no mizbeach. Interesting case. That once it was sprinkled, it's already in the process. It's already in the process. I actually wonder when the blessing is made, because the firstborn son you do a blessing for. I wonder when the blessing would be. At what point? When you hand it over? Good question. At what point do you make a bracha? Because Pidyon Aben makes a bracha on the son. So I think there's a bracha. The question is, do you do the bracha before the sprinkling or before the eating of the meat on the bechor?
So once it started,
In this case,
unless you say that the bracha came after when you gave the meat to the kohen.
This is two separate acts.
That's what we're saying. One ritual, but if you need a mizbeach, you're going to be stuck. But that's the debate.
Two different brachas.
No, I don't think so. No. No, why? You got to be careful when you do that in the beginning. We're going to take you seriously. Exactly. We're going to take you seriously soon. Okay, so then he goes on to the next line. He says, well, the next line in the column, Makish Ma'aseh Bechor. And then what he does is he compares the Ma'aseh to the Bechor. That's because we have a verse. We mentioned that earlier. In the verse, Ma'aseh and Bechor are written together. So he compares the Ma'aseh Sheni to the Bechor. So you see what he's done. He says, just like the Bechor, the meat cannot be done if there's no Beis Hamikdash because you need a temple. So to Ma'aser Sheni you can't do. And therefore, what we're saying is like this. Remember what the answer is. The answer is that the sanctity of Yerushalayim, or the Beis Hamikdash, is only when there's a Beis Hamikdash. The sanctity of the temple is only temporary or short term, not long term. So once the temple is taken away, there's no Kedusha anymore. Which explains why there's no Ma'aser Sheni. He's yeah, no sanctity in Yerushalayim. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what we're saying. That the sanctity of Yerushalayim ends at a certain point. Is limited. Okay, so the sanctity of Yerushalayim ends at a certain point. Our question was, if it ends at a certain point, then what makes you think that the Bechor, in other words, how do you weigh out the Bechor and the Ma'aser? So he's saying the Bechor, the scenario of the Bechor is that it was sprinkled originally. Before the Churban, it was sprinkled. And then the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. And what we say is you can't eat the meat. If that's the case, mice are the same. Okay. So now look at the next question. The Gemara asks, "V'chidavar halomed behekesh." This is a principal question. "V'chidavar halomed behekesh, chozer umelamed behekesh." If something is derived through a juxtaposition, can you now go and teach another law through a juxtaposition? In other words, maybe it's a bit weak. He's questioning who gave the middle case the strength to be able to derive new law. If something is derived from juxtaposition, then you must stop there. You can't then go on and apply it again to the next category. Otherwise, you're going to keep on rolling laws based on juxtapositions. There's going to be a limit. Yesh ladavar sof. There's going to be a stop to this. So the Gemara is saying is generally it should be one. You compare A to B, and you stop there. You can't take B now and apply it to C, and C to D, and D to F, because then there's no limit. That's Gemara's question. So therefore, what do we have here? We said that right, the meat is derived from the blood. Because we saw the verse that juxtaposes the meat to the blood. As it says, their blood,
That's a different text, Ma'aser Sheni.
Yeah, but it's the same way of learning. That's the issue. The issue is not the category of act. The issue is how did you derive it? So if you derive it through a hekesh, through a juxtaposition, there's going to be a limit to how far you can stretch each comparison. So the law of hekesh, by the way, is the halacha of Moshe Messina. Moshe taught us that when two concepts are side by side in the Torah, you can derive one from the other. But then how far can you stretch that? So what we're suggesting is it's one. So what do? You take the blood and you compare the blood to the meat. Just like the blood needs a mizbeach, so too the meat needs a mizbeach. Full stop. Who gave you the right now to compare the firstborn blood or meat to Ma'aser Sheni, and then to apply the same rule? Just like meat you can't eat, so too Ma'aser Sheni you can't eat. That's already stretching the hekesh too far. That's what the Gemara is asking. You have something's learned through a hekesh, you suffice with that. Stop there. Don't abuse or over-abuse the system of learning. So the Gemara says, Meiser dogon chulin hu. The Meiser of grain, i.e. of the Ma'aser Sheni, is non-sacrificial. The reason why I'm saying this is because if you look at footnote 32, the Gemara states the Ma'aser of grain in contrast to the Ma'aser of animals, which is offered as a sacrifice. So Ma'aser of grain is chulin. What is chulin? Chulin is the opposite of kadosh. Chulin means mundane. Kadosh is holy. Chulin is mundane. That's the word chol. Hamavdil ben kadosh l'chol. Chol is the weekday. So chulin is the Aramaic term, or the Gemara's term, for mundane food. So Ma'aser dogon chulin hu. He said the Maisa of grain, i.e. the Maisa Sheni, is non-sacrificial. You don't offer it up. And therefore, he says, if you look at the article adds on, therefore, a two-stage hekesh is admissible in this case, since the law disallowing such derivations applies only to sacrificial laws. Where does he get that from? How does he know that? That it only applies to some categories of, not to everything. Yeah. This is all oral tradition. Rashi says, and when it comes to the mundane, we're able to learn the laws out from one another. So we clarify. What did Moshe Rabbeinu teach us orally? Moshe Rabbeinu taught us orally, you can't compare Hekesh to Hekesh, or you can't learn Hekesh from Hekesh when it comes to matters of Kabbonos and sacrificial offerings. Then you can't compare one to the other. But when we learn laws of Chulin, of the mundane, of the material, then you can learn across one from the other. And because Meiser Dogon, the Meiser of grain, is not offered up as a sacrifice, therefore it's considered Chulin, it's not considered holy, even though it has to be eaten in Yerushalayim. But it's still considered Chulin because it doesn't go on the altar. And because of that, you can learn it out from the Hekesh. Interesting principle.
Now you said that the mice of the grain, right? Not completely.
Yeah. It's great, yeah. On the one hand, it's a holy contribution.
Eat fruit and meat, vegetables, we don't do. That's quite a status. Eating something in veg on it.
Yeah, sure.
So as opposed to bread. Sorry?
When he says grain, he means bread.
Yeah, when I say bread.
Not all grain do vegetable.
Yeah, okay, but
Right? Not all grain.
we make the juice.
Exactly. Fruit juice, you won't necessarily wash. That's because of Kriyas. That's because of Kriyas Soda, because they're making a meal on it.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna. I hear the suggestion. We're gonna put it aside. Okay. Over the page. This is now.
The non-sacrificial, you can't expand it.
If it was non-sacrificial, you shouldn't be able to
Expand it.
Why? Because it's less holy. It means to learn one hekesh from another hekesh. One juxtaposition. It's weaker.
It's weaker, so why can you make it even more?
So the question is, I don't think there's any logic when it comes to this. I mean, maybe we can try. I'm not going to push away the conversation. The halacha la Moshe b'Sinai means there's no logic. Moshe Rabbeinu, God decided this is the way laws are. Lewis is saying, but explain why. Okay. Maybe I can tell you this. I would love to know the answer. I don't feel obliged to figure out the answer. It would be nice to have an insight as to why here yes and here no, especially that logically maybe it's the other way around. But I don't think we have to feel obliged to have an answer, because when it comes to halacha Moshe Sinai, principle is principle, and that's it.
How can you know that it's from Sinai? Halacha from Sinai.
The way the Gemora is discussing it, I mean, the article adds that in. Rashi says that you can see from the Rashi is just explaining the Gemara. So you see that from the terminology of the Gemara that this is like status. This is how it goes. This is how it goes. And therefore he's saying that you can learn Meiser from the Bechor. That's how we know it. So the Bechor, the blood was sprinkled, and because the blood is dependent on the mizbeach, the meat can't be eaten. If the meat can't be eaten, the ma'aser also can't be eaten, because the sanctity of Yerushalayim. We haven't discussed the sanctity of Israel, but we established the following principle: the fact that we're debating these sacrifices means that we believe that Israel does retain its sanctity, because otherwise, if it didn't retain its sanctity, you wouldn't need to discuss this at all. If Israel lost its sanctity, then no discussion about Meiser or Bechor would be necessary, because Israel has lost its sanctity. Our discussion is we seem to be accepting that Israel's sanctity is there even today. The question is, does Yerushalayim's sanctity hold itself? And can you eat the fruit of Yerushalayim? That's the question. Yeah. Without a Beis Hamikdash, without a Mizbeach. That's the point. Even though we'll definitely, that's the point.
You don't hold this intelligence sanctity.
That's right.
Right.
That's what seems like. That's what seems like again, from what we're learning. Yeah.
Okay.
No. You're obligated to separate it, which we do, by the way. We separate Trumas and Maasros today.
Yeah.
We're obligated to separate it, but you can't eat it. So you just throw it to the ground, rather. Well, what else can you do?
You can't feed it to the animal.
No. So today, that's what they do. Today, they take barrels and barrels of fruit from all the factories, and they just throw it back into the ground. And they let it rot.
I think you must start a company to make fuel out of it in that place.
I don't know if fuels which you don't consume.
That fuel, so that you can have
Auto
stuff.
waste. Yeah.
Yeah. You can have.
I wonder if you're allowed to.
To use it to do that.
Yeah, you benefit. Yeah, would you be? Although you're not eating it, you are benefiting. I don't know. You can't give it away to somebody else to eat. The question is, can you reprocess it to a different form to assist you?
Again, how much of it is dumped, so to speak?
Why?
Because in order to do what
I see.
suggested,
The quantity, how much you need for that. Yeah.
and it's not all the time, am I right?
No, it was per. I don't know how often they come they do it per harvest. Every time there's oranges that are collected and brought in, that's when they have to. Okay, each factory is going to work differently, but that's the point. Every time a factory, yeah. Okay, let's go on here over the page to 19b1. Now, okay, so what we're going to say now is that it's not so simple that you can learn a hekesh out of a hekesh. Okay. Okay, there's a debate here. What's new? Let's read it. This is satisfactory according to the one who says that in determining whether a two-stage hekesh is one of sacrificial law, to apply it, we follow the subject that learns its law through the second hekesh. If that matter is non-sacrificial, okay, then I'll explain in a second. Then the issue is not considered a case of sacrificial law, even if the first hekesh is made between two sacrificial matters. Okay, so there's something called basar lamed azlinan, the word lamed, and one called basar melamed azlinan. When you have to discuss, when you have to learn, when you debate, can I learn two hekeshes or not? We said it depends. If it's sacrificial laws of korbanos on the Mizbeach, then we said you can't learn it. What God said, you can't derive two. But if it's mundane, like the mice that we said was mundane, it's not offered up, then you can learn one from the other. The question is, when you're comparing two sacrifices to another, which case determines whether or not you can learn this? Do you go based on the teacher of the hekesh, or do you go based on the? Do you go based? Let's summarize like this: A teaches B. That's the first hekesh. Everyone agrees that that's okay. A teaches B. B then teaches C. The debate is, can B teach C? The new laws. So we say it depends. If you're discussing sacrificial law, B can't teach C. If you're discussing a regular, mundane, B can teach C. Okay? How do you define what cases you're discussing? What happens if B is sacrificial and C is mundane? Or the way around. What happens if B is mundane and C is sacrificial? Well, how do you decide if this is a category of sacrificial law that we're discussing, and then you can't derive it, or this is a category of the mundane, and then you can derive it? And the debate is based on, I think we would normally say, is what case are we trying to derive? What is C? That's how I would imagine. Tell me what C is. What's the outcome? Is C sacrificial law? Then I can't learn it. If C is regular, mundane, then I can learn. That's not how the Gemara learns. The Gemara says there's two options. Either you go via C, which is called in terminology here, lamed, means the outcome. So you analyze the outcome. That's the outcome. The C, the third case, is going to define the whole learning. So look what he says here. So that's satisfactory according to the one who says that in determining whether a two-stage hekesh is one of sacrificial law or not, we follow the subject that learns its law through the second hekesh. That's C. You follow the subject of the case that learns its law through the hekesh, i.e., what is C discussing? If that matter of C is non-sacrificial, like the Meiser, then the issue is not considered a case of sacrificial law, even if the first hekesh is made between two sacrificial matters. So even if the Bechor is also not sacrificial, but even the case is that okay, I'll get to the Bechor in a second. But even if A and B are sacrificial, and B is also sacrificial, but because C is not, the law doesn't apply, and you can learn it out as a hekesh. Why? Because you go based on the topic you're trying to learn. C, which is the way I would understand it. That's how I understood it. When you're trying to understand mundane food, like Meiser, and the law doesn't apply, because when you look at the final product, the final item, that's how we're learning now. But there's another opinion who says, let's just finish this case, maybe don't go via C. Maybe look at B, because B is the origin of the law. B is, according to the one who says that in determining whether the issue is one of sacrificial law, we follow the subject that teaches the law through the second hekesh. You follow a subject that teaches the law. What are you going to say? Let me explain this in a second. You asked the question, Craig, of whether the meat of the animal is offered up as a korban. It sounds like, based on this, is the meat of the Bechor would be offered up as a korban, and parts of the meat is taken off the Mizbeach and then handed over to the Kohen. And that's why if you have no Mizbeach to offer it up on, then you can't eat it, which makes the Bechor sacrificial meat. The Ma'aser Sheni, on the other hand, doesn't get put on the altar at all, and the owners just take of it and eat off it in Yerushalayim. So now what he's saying is like this. So now what he's saying is like this. If you believe on the second thought that the Melamed, the teacher of the second Hekesh, is the one that sets the tone for the whole Hekesh, the teacher is the Bechor. And the Bechor is sacrificial. And the law is in sacrificial. You can't compare a Hekesh second time round. So it all depends. Do you go via the B or do you go via the C? If you go via the C in our case is Meiser. That's the second Hekesh we're trying to derive. Remember, A in our case is the blood. sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach. B is the meat of the bechor. C, the last category that we're trying to understand, is ma'aser.
Yes, if you can't go further than A and B, you can't sacrificial.
That's exactly. You can't go further than A and B in sacrificial, but you can go in mundane law. So the question is, do you define right? So the question is, do you define C? Right, you can go into C in non-sacrificial meat, but do you define C based on C, or do you define C based on what B is? Because B is the teacher. I would have thought C. I would have thought you look at the last case you're trying to learn, and that will define whether or not you can apply the law or not. Yes. Okay. So that's it. So you're saying that B should set the tone because B is the one that's learning. Okay, that's the debate is all based on halacha Moshe Messina. What did Moshe teach us? Did he teach us that you go via the C, or did he teach us that you go via the B? How do you define? So let's explain the question. We answered that the reason we know the meiser cannot be eaten in Yerushalayim.
There's no logical connection between C and B.
There's just the fact that they juxtaposed. That's
what it says here.
The pasuk says so. Yeah. So we're saying it. Yeah, because hekesh is because another principle for Moshe. It's two principles that together in the verse you can compare the two. So another question: can you compare it? So we said before that because meiser is chulin, meiser is mundane, it doesn't get offered up in the mizbeach. We can then learn it out as a second hekesh. That's what we answered earlier. So you have blood to meat, meat to meiser. That's what we said. But now the question is that's all good and fine if you go via C, which is meiser, and that allows you to then apply the next hekesh.
I would have imagined that it's the weakest link in the chain. So
Well, either way.
Either way. So if one is sacrificial,
If one of them is.
Yeah, one of them is sacrificial, you can't go to the second.
Yeah.
That's not up for discussion.
But you are.
Not up for discussion.
Yeah, that's what I mean. But you are basically saying that if B is sacrificial, you're saying either way, either whether B or C is sacrificial, you can't continue. Okay. The Gemora is not suggesting that. The Gemora is saying, you decide. If you follow B, you follow B. You follow C, you follow C. Okay, so let's start to ask the question. So if we said the meiser is mundane, therefore you can learn it out of meat. The Gemara is saying, not so simple. That all works good and fine according to one opinion who holds that you go after the lamed. The lamed means the C, what you're learning out. And because meiser is mundane, you can then derive it. But if you go according to the melamed, the teacher, i.e. B is the source of the information, it's the teacher, and B is meat of sacrificial meat of the bechor, no, you can't apply it then to meiser. You got a problem, because how are you going to know whether or not you can eat the meiser in Yerushalayim or not? That's what we're asking. The Gemara says, Damu basar chada milsahi. The meat and the blood are really part of one thing. And because they're part of one offering, i.e. the bechor, we actually don't necessarily need the first hekesh. In other words, this is a unique case. And the hekesh between dam and basar is not a real hekesh. It's the same sacrifice. You haven't actually gone and stretched it to a B. You've actually it's actually A1 and A2. That's what we're saying. It's A1 and A2. It's
all part of the same thing.
The meat and the blood.
When you put the blood on, the meat.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's all part of it.
Yeah. It's acknowledging your point that once you've offered up, but what it's saying is, but it's all part of one point. You're right, and because he's saying the other way, he's using your logic but against your theory. He's saying it's because of what it's part of one point, and because it's part of one point, you can no longer eat of it, even though the blood was sprinkled. Because listen, because you wanted to argue that because the blood was sprinkled, therefore you should be able to eat the meat. So it's part of one offering. You offered up the blood. You started, right? Right. He's saying he's using the same theory but the opposite way. He's saying just like blood is dependent on the altar, so too meat should be dependent on the altar. Happens to be that blood had an altar. Meat has no altar in our scenario.
But they're not split, they're saying that they're not putting the
It's one thing.
It's one thing.
one thing.
So therefore, I'm not saying that the third section almost waters it down.
Yeah. It's not a real hekesh.
It's not hekesh, but actually the second
It's the real one. It's the real one. And that's why everyone will agree you can apply it to mice.
because it's not a hekesh.
Interesting. 3. The Aruch Lineh, let's just look at 3. Elaborates as follows. Since the meat of the offering may never be eaten until the blood is applied to the altar, as we learned, the eating of the meat is intrinsically bound up with the service of the blood. Well, that's again, Rod, it's your point. The meat can never be eaten until the blood is applied. So therefore, it's intrinsically bound with the service of the blood. Thus, the original Hekesh merely clarifies the extent to which the Bechor service itself depends upon the existence of the altar. Just clarifying that point is that both aspects, Dam and Basar, are both dependent on the altar. And the extension of the law to Ma'aser Sheni is in its first application in a novel context, meaning separating itself to a new category. It becomes its own Hekesh, its original Hekesh, so to speak, and that applies in that situation. Now, what this would mean is that my question is like this. For some reason, I think I have this memory, just as a side note, about Ma'aser. At today's tithe in Israel, for some reason, rings a bell that it's rabbinical, not biblical. This is part of the conversation. If you hold that the sanctity of Israel, not even Yerushalayim, if you hold that the sanctity of Israel is everlasting, then the contribution is biblical. Nothing changed. If you hold that something did change as a result of exile, and the sanctity is no longer there, right? Then the fact that we take off Ma'aser today is a rabbinical law put in place by the rabbis to retain the status quo of Ma'aser. No, Shemitah in fact is also the Rabban, because Shemitah is also based on the Shemitah is also based on people living there, and Shemitah is also based in Yovel. The Jubilee is also part of that. We don't have a Jubilee today. We don't keep 49th year and 50th year. So I think Shemitah is rabbinical today. That doesn't take away, doesn't take the severity of it. We still keep it. We still keep it, but it's just important to clarify: is it biblical or is it rabbinical? I think we hold this today. Ma'aser is rabbinical, and so is Shemitah.
Because the financial implication people.
Sure, it's huge. Although the Torah says you'll be blessed with more produce, that's a tough. As a farmer, that's a tough test. Very tough test. I always find that ironic because on the one hand it says that your 6th year will produce enough produce for the 7th and the 8th as you start your new produce. On the other hand, the Rambam says that they used to set up gmachs in town to help the farmers during the Shemitah year.
Big fundraising as well.
To help farmers. So which is it? So what happened to the 6th year produce?
I thought that they could export it out the country.
No, they can't benefit.
Status.
They can't benefit.
So why is it issue? Why is
It's
it
takless.
Why is it an issue with bit of Israeli produce that's exported to South Africa?
No, because it's made in Israel, produced during that time. It means they harvested and they worked their farms during the Shemitah. That's a problem.
Okay, so it's not illegal. It's not.
Well, it's halachically illegal. Yeah. No, it's not country-wise illegal. No one in the country will stop you. Halachically is a problem. So when it comes to Woolworths or Pick and Pay, and they're under the Beis Din's jurisdiction, and they don't put a sign to say this is Israeli fruit of the sabbatical, it can cause big issues. So what the Beis Din needs to do is actually keep its finger on the pulse and see where the fruits of, especially this year, because now it's coming in from Israel, is to watch where's it coming from, where they get it from, and just to put up a sign. It's a sign. These are sabbatical year fruits. Your choice if you want to buy them or not.
It's so difficult because today's technology, they take that fruit from Israel, they put it in a storage facility, just unripened, and keep it there for a year.
Yeah, so it may come out in a year's time. And also, here's another issue. It goes. I wonder if it goes from Israel directly to South Africa, or does it go via another country along the way? Repackaged, yeah. So you have no idea which country it actually came from. It's actually fascinating the fact that South Africa is getting its fruit from Israel. Like, there's no other countries in the world to buy fresh from everywhere. Yeah.
Politics, we don't do it.
No.
You mean Israel? You mean Israel? Oh, we should go our own. But it also depends on climate, what types of fruit grow. Oh, we export our fruit. Is that why we're importing? Is that why we're importing fruit? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? I see. That's why you're taking. But you're paying euro rand you're paying euro dollar to bring in that fruit.
Yeah.
So how does that even itself out?
Remember, what is an export?
Yeah, I understand.
There's also different seasons.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Get something that's out of season.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
That's
So
that's how the Fruit of West City was built. That franchise, what's it called? Fresh, whatever it's called.
Fresh Village, no.
Fruit and Veg City.
Yeah,
That was built